Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Reset Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Mignot, CEO of the experience agency D-Flash. Each week on the Reset Podcast, I bring on an interesting guest who's from business, entertainment, and entrepreneurship, who's doing some game-changing work, and we always have a fascinating conversation. This week's episode will be no different, as we're going to talk to David Eastman, CEO of the agency BSSP, and talk about what he's been doing over the last 20 years and how it's a really cool space for him to be in the advertising industry at this very moment. So, David, thank you all for joining the podcast.
You're welcome. I'm thrilled to be here, Laura.
So, I'm sure as you have heard before on this podcast, I always start with the exact same question. It's always fascinating to see where this takes my guests, and I'm sure you'll be no different. David, what was your first job?
Well, the funny thing is that thinking about this question, I've probably got 10 or 15 different answers to it, but I'll give you the one that I think is probably most relevant in terms of it wasn't just a one-off thing. I used to work every Saturday. You can probably tell I'm English. I grew up in southwest London,
Really?
and I worked every Saturday in a large department store that would probably be the equivalent of like a Macy's over here. And I worked in the menswear department, but in a very specific section of the menswear department called Spotlight Him, and it was meant to be the sort of the trendy. This was in the 80s. It was meant to be the sort of the trendy part of the menswear department, but I can tell you that it wasn't trendy. And being sort of, it was fairly suburban in nature. It's like if you imagine going to the sort of suburban mall and going into the Macy's and going to the menswear department, and there being a section where it was meant to be very fashion forward. So it was I probably did it for maybe a year. And I can remember, I actually sort of thought back when I saw that this was the question you asked, I thought back to what I was earning. And I used to pick up an envelope at the beginning of my Saturday, which was the payment for the previous Saturday, and converting it into dollars, my day's pay was just over $9.
Oh my God. We all have to start somewhere.
we did, and you know what I learned? Well, if I sort of think back, well, what did I take away from there? It was dealing with people and the public, and sort of forming relationships based on nothing more than a couple of questions. So it probably paid itself back later on in my career.
Oh, I'm sure. That's the thing that's always fascinating when I ask this question, because you look at what you're doing right now and you think back to those very first jobs about the things that you learned that mattered and stuck with you and then through your career. And then when you're sitting where you are right now, you're like, actually, the thing I learned back then does definitely come in handy. So, okay, so point of personal privilege, where in South London are you from?
I'm from a place called Richmond. Which is, if you're looking at a map of London, it's in the sort of bottom left-hand corner. And I grew up there and left when I went to college. And my mother still lives there, but apart from that, I haven't really stopped traveling since I left there.
Awesome. Only the reason I asked is I'm from South London too, but you can't tell.
Okay.
Because I have no discernible accent anymore. Give me a Hendrix and time.
Whereabouts?
From Surrey, in
Okay. Oh, okay. Well, so amazing. Not very far. So Richmond is also in Surrey, and Croydon is probably, 10 miles away 15 miles away from Richmond. So again, it's funny how small the world is.
It really is. That's like, wait, I remember hearing about Richmond when I was little. So. So it's the world is unbelievably tiny. It's kind of crazy. But that's always great to meet a fellow Brit. So tell me, what do you do now? So what's this BSSP out in California?
Butler Shine Stern and Partners is an advertising agency, an independent advertising agency that has been in existence for 25 years. and it was founded by John Butler, Greg Stern, and Mike Shine. And I joined about 19 months ago, I think now, as Chief Operating Officer, with the agreement that I was going to find my creative partner, Chief Creative Officer, whom we hired last September. And at that point, I became Chief Executive, and my creative partner, Matt Curry, and I are both now partners in the agency. And we both have similar backgrounds in terms of working at big holding company-owned agencies, but preferring the more sort of boutique intimacy and the creativity that is capable within that of an independent agency.
Awesome. And so, how does someone go from Richmond in the UK and end up out in California at Butler Shine and Partners? I mean, I know for me, it was a wild security flood, and I'm sure for you, it was probably even more so since you're a bit more senior than I am. So how that all happen?
Well, I guess it happened, you can only, I think the Steve Jobs quote, isn't it? You can only really understand sort of how things happen by looking back and connecting the dots. But I suppose the short story is that I wanted to be an actor. And I was in lots of productions when I was at school, and I thought that it was just going to be a passing fad, but then it became something that I seriously wanted to do. So I went to drama school, which is, I guess, I'm not sure if there's an equivalent over here, but it's essentially like a degree level course, but there's no, it's all practical. There's very little written or theory, and I learned how to become an actor. We studied the Stanislavski acting method, and then I got my equity card, because at that time there was a union-based approach to acting in the UK. You had to have an equity card to get a job, and you had to have a job to get an equity card. So there was this little sort of weird thing about how you had to get an equity card. And I joined a theatre company and toured the David Mamet play, Glengarry Glen Ross, and got my equity card, and then spent the next probably 3 years going to lots of auditions. And I guess I'll jump to the sort of the conclusion is that it obviously didn't work out for me, because otherwise I wouldn't have ended up in marketing and advertising. But I remember distinctly being out of work from an acting point of view. I used to work in the bar at Soho House in London, serving drinks to actors and artists and writers, and feeling like I would never end up standing on that side of the bar rather than being on the inside of the bar. And then I met a friend of a friend who said, "Are you interested in doing something other than working behind a bar?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. What have you got?" And he told me about this internet company that he was working at, interactive agency in the UK called Online Magic. And I started there as an account executive in 1998. And by the time I joined, the conversation was well underway for Online Magic to become the UK office of agency.com that had been started in the US a few years earlier. And I can sort of scroll forward. We went public on NASDAQ in November of I think it was November of 2000, and then the bubble burst not long after that. And so we came off of the NASDAQ index and were brought fully back into Omnicom. And sort of gradually, as this process is going on and the years are ticking by, I ran the mobile channels division in the London office. Then I went to run the Amsterdam office, and then I came back and ran the London office. And then probably, I guess, a couple of years before you got there, I went across to New York to run the network. And we were within a larger advertising entity at that point called TBWA. So we were housed in the TBWA building. And I think it was really, I guess it was the first wave of the internet and the first wave of these design and build agencies. And the fascinating thing about that time, and I guess we're talking about 2003, 4, 5, 6, was that advertising agencies and interactive agencies really didn't understand and hadn't worked out how to work with each other. Yep. And you had, and maybe that is sort of still the case today in some areas, I don't know, but I know that we found ourselves being misunderstood, I guess, in terms of what we did. And I think that the ad agency was also trying to understand, well, how can they fit what we do into what they do? And I think that sort of the reverberations of that are probably still playing out today, because you have agencies like RGA, who were very much originally a digital agency, but now do end-to-end communications, and all of the bigger traditional shops, the Ogilvy's, the BBDOs, the TBWAs, they've all figured digital out in their own way. But continuing my story, after agency.com, I went back to the UK with Omnicom to run a group of agencies, like a small mini holding company of digital and technology agencies that was really interesting. And then I got recruited by WPP to go back to New York to become global head of digital for J. Walter Thompson in New York. And about a year or 15 months into that role, I got promoted to CEO of North America for JWT, which was an amazing, it was an amazing experience. And again, I was still dealing with a lot of the issues of how does digital work and play and sit and fit within one of the most traditional advertising agencies, and I'm going to use the past tense now, that there was in the industry. And then after JWT, I went to a user experience design agency, also in New York, as a partner, with the proviso. There were some people that were ex-agency.com employees who had founded the agency, I think in the early 2000s, and wanted to understand how to sell it. And because at JWT I'd done quite a lot of acquisitions, I understood the process and helped them sell to M&C Saatchi. And then sort of during that period, I met a guy called Greg Stern, who's one of the founders here at Butler Shine Stern and Partners. And I'd also been on the board at the 4As when I was at JWT and met him there. And we just struck up a relationship and a conversation. And then he called me pretty much out the blue and said, would I be interested in moving to California and becoming a partner in the agency, and with a view to potentially taking it over and running it. And as with lots of things in life, it's all to do with timing. It just happened to be the time for me and my partner. And we moved out here in the fall of 2017.
That's an incredible story. Awesome.
Thank you.
It was a very, very simple path, with very straightforward. Like, there was one thing led to the next. There was no circuitous path at all. That's fantastic. And for you, David, like, what's been the biggest change? Because now you said you've been traveling since you left Richmond, but like, going from New York to California in the world of agency, how has that transition been for you?
Well, it's interesting. It's a really interesting question, because I think that there's a number of different levels to that question. I think there's the cultural level of working, almost forgetting about what industry you're working in, but moving from working in New York. I lived and worked in Manhattan for 10 years, and then moving to California. And I lived down in Silicon Valley in Atherton. because my partner works at Facebook, and the cultural shift from life in Manhattan to life, I guess, sort of in the burbs in California, was one that probably took me 3 or 4 months to acclimate to. It's a very different lifestyle, and one that now I wouldn't sort of swap. But the intensity of Manhattan, which is sort of doubled by working in an advertising agency in Manhattan, that took a while for that to decompress from me, and for me to sort of feel I was feeling more relaxed. And so there's the cultural level, and then the sort of the business. It's still the same business, but there's more of an informality about the business on the West Coast than the East Coast. And I'm not putting a judgment on that, whether that's good, bad, right, or wrong. It's just something that I notice. I think it's just a more relaxed approach to business. Doesn't mean that things aren't as important, or deadlines are any longer or shorter. But it just feels more. Maybe it's to do with the sun. It just feels a bit more laid back.
Well, it is about, leaving the concrete jungle, and you actually get, 77 and sunny pretty much every single day when you're out.
Yeah.
So that does help with the psyche. And, since you had this really incredible career, what do you think has been the biggest challenge along the way? You've had opportunities where you've been, gone from, being being a CEO, then going somewhere else and starting something new. So what would you say has been the biggest challenge for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The answer that I had when I saw your questions was the biggest challenges have been when there have been major shifts in the industry, and on a personal level, trying to make sure that I navigate my career in the direction of growth. And an example of that would be when the dot-com bubble finally burst, and we made, I think at the time I was at agency.com in London, perhaps we were around 500 people in that office, and we made half the people redundant in one day because of the costs we had to cut. And that was the first time I'd ever really sort of understood the impact of people losing their livelihoods and their jobs in an environment where it really wasn't certain whether the interactive space and digital as it was at the time would recover. And, there were people that had joined the agency, and nobody had come. When people had joined digital agencies in the 90s, they weren't coming from other digital agencies. They were coming from other professions. So it felt like a really sort of pioneering time at that point. But when the house of cards eventually came tumbling down, it was a very sobering moment for me, because there was a point in time where I wasn't sure whether I was going to be affected by that or not. And once I knew that I wasn't, I realized that I was going to have a lot of conversations with people. And that is a very chastening thing to do, particularly at that scale. And if I sort of think forward from there in terms of challenges, they've all been around really trying to adapt whatever business or agency that I've been in. You have to sort of figure out, well, this is the direction we're going to go in, which means we're no longer going to be supporting X, Y, and Z capabilities. Therefore, we have to think about what we're going to do with those capabilities, and how do you change the engines on the plane while it's still in flight, which I think is probably the eternal question for anybody who's running an agency.
Yeah, it's it just is such a crazy up and down through the woods, neck of the woods you have to go through. And so for you,
yeah.
having all this experience and being at this senior level, what would you have told, 25-year-old David who doesn't want to be an actor anymore and is now kind of embarking on this advertising thing? Because now looking back.
Well, it's funny enough, I've sort of heard this, I'm not sure if it's becoming a bit of a trope now, but that back then, the advice that I was given by people more senior than me, but perhaps not in the profession that I was in, because back then at that time I was an actor, and people were saying, follow your passion. And I actually think that that is now incorrect advice, and that you should be figuring out what you're good at. And if you figure out something that you're good at that you can then feel passionate about, then you've found something that you can perhaps do in one way, shape or form for the rest of your life. But the prerequisite for becoming successful and fulfilled, and those two things are different. And I think I used to confuse success with fulfillment when I was that age. Talent is a prerequisite for that, and it takes time to figure out what you're talented at. And some people don't find it until they're, in their sort of 30s and 40s, and some people stumble on it, almost by mistake when they're in their teenage years. And I was very passionate about being an actor, but I have a very subjective view, obviously, of my own capability, but the industry decided that I wasn't good enough. Right. And one of the things that I think I learned was, maybe if I'd given advice to myself from now back to then, I'd say find an industry where it's not necessarily about, it's an industry that chooses you. Being an actor or being a musician or being a dancer or being a writer or being any form of artist, that thing has to choose you. You can't choose it. I think that's probably the most sort of fundamental lessons that I would have told myself if I could have spoken to myself.
Good old bit of time travel. No, I think that's fantastic advice, because I think, not everyone is going to be Beyonce. No. And I think that oftentimes is the problem in our industry, that, because things are so much easier now. Yes, if you have a question, you go to Google. If you want to search something, you can go look on YouTube and learn how to do something. But that doesn't mean that you have the inherent talent to, create something like Homecoming, for example. So, sure. And I think the more that we are able to sort of acknowledge that like not everyone's going to get that trophy. Someone has to win, someone has to lose, but you can find your niche and not be afraid to try and fail in a few things. I think is also really, key with regard to your awesome.
I do too. I think that's a really good point. And I would encourage, I was sort of mentoring college age kids today. I think failure is something that you don't have careers, or we aren't going to have careers now like people, maybe our parents or grandparents did, where you do the same thing for 50 years. People are going to have multiple careers. They're going to have parallel careers. And, the Beyonce sort of example is really good, because aside from talent, what Beyonce has is persistence and determination and hunger and resilience. And, those are all the things that you need to carry with you as qualities. Having talent alone isn't enough. You have to have a talent for having a talent. And I think that is all of those other qualities. And then the two things that I think that anybody needs that you cannot make happen, no matter how talented you are or how determined or how resilient you are, is luck and timing. And, if I look back, at my sort of career, there's a very healthy dose of luck and being in the right place at the right time.
Oh, absolutely. There's a really great book that I read when I was in college, and it was called The Ethnic Myth, and I'm forgetting the name of the author. But it was all about, luck, timing, and skills. And those are the three elements that make success or failure. So if you're not at the right time, at the right place with the right skills, and the example they give is Bill Gates. Like the year he was born, that was the year that they started doing X amount of computer programming. So by the time he was 12, 13 years old, having those sort of camps was a thing that was happening. And so he could go to those camps. Had he been born 2 years earlier, he doesn't, it's not popular by the time he's of the age when you would go to camp. And then if you have that skill at that right particular moment when people need someone to do X, Y, Z in computer programming, and he's been doing it for 7 years as opposed to people who've been doing it 5 years, he doesn't become the person that people come to. And then it kind of goes through that process. And it always stuck with me because, I think oftentimes, especially when we're younger, we think, well, oh, I missed my chance and I'm never going to have it again. It's like, well, no, that, there's going to come a time when your luck and the timing of your skill all line up together. And when that does, you have to be ready for it. And when you
couldn't agree more.
That's when you're going to knock it out of the park.
I think there's also a sort of another element to luck, and maybe it's actually sort of the fundamental element, and it's something that I'm just trying to think of his name, Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great. He calls it who luck, and they've done a lot of research following people's careers, mainly the careers of CEOs at these sort of level 5 companies that he follows. And these CEOs have sort of translated their own careers into the people that they met along the way that either enabled them to get to the next level or mentored them through a particular challenge. And we all have those people in our network, whether we realize it or we don't. Maybe they're our parents, maybe they're our siblings, maybe they're close friends, maybe they're sort of colleagues from previous jobs. But understanding that your career, and whatever career that is, tends to be driven by the people that you meet and the relationships that you have with them. Another great piece of advice I think I'd have given myself, or I'd give any young people, is develop your relationships and invest in those relationships, because you never know quite how much someone can affect you for the better. And it may not be now, it may not be in 2 years, maybe 10 years down the road. But certainly for me, the luck that I had in my career and the timing, there was a sort of healthy dose of, well, I just had relationships with people who were sort of also in the right place in the right time to be able to help me. And I think that's a really, for me, I look back at that and think without those people, perhaps we wouldn't be talking, because I wouldn't be in this role that I'm doing now.
Yeah, it really is key. It's like, it's also being able to talk to people and have people mentor you along the way, and take the extra time to go for that pint or have a coffee with someone who's more senior or someone who's junior or someone who's at their level, and make that friend, because you never know where people end up. Like as we were chatting, we both were at an agency a couple of years apart, and here we are, 15 years later, having a chat over Zoom.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So you never know where it's going to take you. So,
No.
So as you are now, CEO at BSSP, where do you all see things going for you guys next?
We're, we've been a creative agency since the word go, and I think that creativity is something that is still going to be fundamental to growth of brands, products and services. And I think it's just the nature of where that creativity shows up and how it shows up. And it can be, whereas it was very easy to sort of segment agencies maybe 10 or 15 years ago into, you could tell what sort of agency they were by looking at their output or their product. And some of that product might be direct mail. It might come through your mailbox, or you might see it on the TV, in which case that's above the line, as they sort of, I haven't heard that expression for a long time, but that's what they used to call those agencies. But now everything seems to be blurred. And I think the thing that has blurred it is digital. And digital is one of those words that it means everything now. And I can remember having a conversation probably 10 years ago. It was actually a sort of fairly robust conversation with a person who worked on the same client that I was working at, but at another agency. And I was representing the digital agency at the time. And this person his argument was that digital is a subset of marketing. And my argument was that it's actually the reverse, that marketing is a subset of digital, because digital is everything and will continue to become more and more as it sort of disrupts and makes its way through every element of our lives as consumers and as people who run businesses. So, what that means for BSSP now is that we are rethinking the agency in terms of what sorts of skill sets do you need in today's world. And I think, again, that has changed from what it was 10 years ago, where, if you were a direct agency, you'd be looking for someone who had those sorts of skills and came from that sort of background. Now we're looking for Swiss Army knives. We're looking for people that are hybrid and that can, they can edit stuff, they can shoot stuff, they can code, they can come up with ideas that they can then actually make. So we promote the maker culture here at BSSP, and I don't know whether that's sort of going the right way or not, but it certainly feels like it's about maintaining relevance. And to be relevant today, I think you have to be an organization that can get to prototypes quickly and build things and involve clients early and just make the whole thing run faster and lower to the ground.
Awesome. Okay, my last question. So now that you're in California for a couple of years now, what's your favorite restaurant?
I find myself going back to Sushi Ran all the time, which is, for those of your listeners who don't know, it's obviously a sushi restaurant, but it's a Michelin star sushi restaurant in Sausalito, which is sort of slightly counterintuitive.
I was going to say, wow.
Quite a small, sleepy place. But they have the fish flown in from Japan daily. And it is the most, and having been in some spectacular sushi restaurants in New York, this is certainly up there. And it's one of those hidden gems where I think, if you came to Sausalito, you wouldn't necessarily be coming to Sausalito for Sushi Ran. But because I'm now based here, I try and take my clients there as often as I can.
Awesome. All right. So my next time I'm out in California, I think I know where I'm having a cocktail with you. Well,
sure.
It's been such a delight to have you on the show and such wonderful insights, and always great to meet a fellow South Londoner. And it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure, Laura. It's a privilege to do this with you, and thank you, and I will continue to be a listener.
Thanks so much.